long-serving Prime Minister. One of the reasons for that, there's a range of causes obviously, but one of the main reasons for that is because of the Labor split of 1955 and the emergence of the DLP. So just one example is the 61 election and the 1969 election with John Gorton, where DLP preferences played a strong role in allowing first the Menzies government, but then later Liberal governments to be re-elected. And so during that period, you have Menzies Liberals and Santa Maria's movement, or the DLP, although they're two distinct things, being closely connected to each other and mutually reinforcing each other in a way. But what I wanted to look at today in the 1942 to 54 period is the way in which these movements had a lot in common with each other. Okay, so we know that anti-communism was a core feature of the Menzies program, both in opposition and government, from 1942 to 1954. And as has been established by many, many scholars, too many to mention by name, Menzies' anti-communism wasn't just based on reaction or fear, as some have argued, but based on his deep commitment to British liberal principles. Menzies, like many liberals, viewed communism as a threat to the British way of life and the tradition of ordered liberty, which he understood to have emerged from the British tradition. So that's one pillar of opposition to communism in Australia, what you might call the British or the liberal or the Protestant tradition in the country. But during the same period, I argue that there's another pillar of anti-communism that is prominent but draws its anti-communism from different sources. And that, of course, is the Catholic-led movement to defeat communism in the labour movements, in the labour unions, and to prevent the growth of communist influence in the ALP through Bob Santa Maria and his organisation. And what I think is clear is that the movement of Santa Maria created a significant political subculture that drew on Catholic social teaching and European political thought to oppose communism. So it drew on sources very different to Menzies in opposition to communism. So while Menzies obviously used communism or anti-communism to win elections and to form his political program, Menzies and his followers, not Menzies and his followers, Santa Maria and his followers approached things from their own tradition. And they looked at Menzies as something of an other, in that he shared their anti-communism, but they were very suspicious of him in the 1942 to 54 period. So what I'm going to look at in this 20 minutes at least is how Menzies was viewed through the movement's publication, which was originally called Freedom in 1942 to 1946, and then from that time on it was known as News Weekly. So I'll start by looking a little bit at Menzies' attitudes, although that's not going to be the main focus of the talk today, then at the movement's attitudes and what they had in common with each other despite being on different sides of the political divide in the 1940s. Okay. So we know that Robert Menzies' staunch opposition to communism grew out of his attachment to 19th century British liberal ideals that formed the culture in which he was raised and educated. Modern political debates about whether Menzies was a conservative or a liberal try and impose current political categories on the past. But most readings of Menzies' speeches and writings can conclude very clearly that he adhered to a distinct form of Australian liberalism, informed by a Whig reading of British history. In a sense, Menzies was a conservative liberal in that he sought to conserve the British liberal tradition that he saw as under attack from the forces of socialism and communism. Stephen Chavura and Greg Malouche have argued that Menzies is a cultural Puritan with a commitment to ideals of sturdiness, independence, freedom, self-scrutiny, godliness, duty, and domestic life. And those themes are present throughout the Forgotten People speeches. Judith Brett has argued that Menzies' Protestant heritage informed his rhetorical commitment, at least, to British liberty, and his strong belief that a cohesive society required men and their families to have the means to be independent of the state and to cultivate a commitment to the community. In Menzies' view, the British Protestant and liberal tradition was best symbolised by the free individual who worked hard, owned property, gained an education for himself, and was therefore able to contribute to the community. State socialism and revolutionary communism both sought to crush that individual into a collective. So those values of independence, individuality, education formed much of the basis of Menzies' suspicion of both state socialism and communism. And it informed, in the 1940s in particular, Menzies' opposition to three of the Labor government's referendums in 1944, in 1946 and 1948, which sought to increase the power of the state, with the exception of one of the questions in 46, which was on social services, and which is the only one that passed, and the anniversary of that occurred recently. Okay. In relation to Santa Maria and the movement, Bob Santa Maria was an outsider to the British Liberal and Protestant world and establishment of Australia. He was born to Italian migrants, so he was an outsider even in the predominantly Irish Catholic culture of Mannix's Melbourne. A brilliant student like Menzies, he found himself at the Christian Brothers St Kevin's College in Toorak on a scholarship, and afterwards proceeded to the University of Melbourne to study law and arts. Involved in the Campion Society, he learnt the ideas of such Catholic thinkers as Hilaire Belloc, G.K. Chesterton, and Christopher Dawson. And he was appointed by Daniel Mannix to work at the National Secretariat for Catholic Action, involved in the publication of The Catholic Worker as its editor, and wrote for that publication for its first 4 years. And the ideas of that publication were very much influenced by the Catholic social teaching of the popes and the likes of Belloc and Chesterton. Strongly opposed to atheistic communism, Santa Maria, and he and his disciples, so to speak, eventually advocated for a range of policies that was called distributism, but basically advocated for a small state, and they didn't want to have a big welfare state, which became the predominant viewpoint on the left in the West. So, as a result of all of this, Santa Maria and his allies were suspicious of both the Anglo-Protestant establishment in Australia, as they would have called it, and the threat of communism and state socialism. So when News Weekly, or Freedom as it was originally called, started being published in 1942, it was critical of both state-centric socialism and obviously the ideas of the Liberal Party as it was reconstituted in 1944. Okay. So the Freedom program, which they began to advocate in 1943, was always listed on their publication. And they called for, among other things, public control of monopolies, public control of credit, industrial councils, assistance to small owners, part ownership of industry for workers, family homes for all, a strong program of regionalism and decentralisation, and a national campaign for family land settlements. So during the period from 1942 to about 1950, the viewpoint on Menzies of the movement was expressed through this publication. So I'd like to explore that for a moment. So first of all, the movement's view of the United Australia Party and then the Liberal Party was that it was representative of a corrupt establishment. After the UAP and Country Party defeat at the 1943 election, Freedom editorialised that the coalition only served the gods of big business and that they were no more democratic than the red fascist and communist bosses. Later, Freedom simply saw the newly named Liberals as a rebadging of a party of bankers, industrialists and monopolists. In this framing, the establishment that would come to be represented by Menzies fitted in with the communist critique. Menzies and the coalition were seen as a sectional party similar to Labor, but in the interest of the big end of town. While such statements can be seen as exaggerated, they also speak to the suspicion of Anglo-Protestant capitalism that was present in much of Catholic social thought in the English-speaking world. So Balloch, Dawson and Chesterton all viewed, as I said before, the Reformation as the source of many of the economic problems of the 20th century. And so for Santa Maria and his followers in the 1940s, they shared that suspicion. So secondly, the movement saw Menzies' creation of the Liberal Party on the ashes of the UAP as simply an attempt to put what they called wartime clothes on the old party. The new Liberal Party's commitment to freedom would mean nothing, Freedom editorialised, unless it was ready to fight monopoly, to demand realistic measures to destroy monopoly, and measures which will be economically hurtful to monopoly so that the small man can live. Protestations about freedom serve only to bring that sacred cause into dispute. Is the end of the quote. So the movement could not take seriously the claims of a new Liberal Party to represent the interests of small business and small farmers because the movement saw big business and the state as hostile to the interest of workers and families. And from the perspective of the Santa Maria movement, both an enlarged state and a concentration of power in large businesses was a threat to freedom and the independence of common men and their families. Another common theme of Freedom and News Weekly in their attitude to Menzies during this period was that he was an enemy of the Labor movement politically, and as a person who benefited from the divisions over communism, he was not an effective anti-communist leader or fighter. So in 1945, for example, Menzies was accused by the publication of playing politics over the issue of communism in the trade unions, whereas Ben Chifley had taken pragmatic measures to ensure the ending of the communist-inspired strike in New South Wales in December 1945. Menzies advocated for hard measures or harsh measures, including the imprisonment of some of the strikers, which the writers at Freedom believed would have inflamed the situation to the benefit of the communists. In the view of Freedom, Menzies could not be relied upon to act as a statesman in such matters because he benefited from any turmoil in the union movement and did not see the union movement as essential to the welfare of Australian working people. The movement clearly believed that Menzies' policies would harm their efforts to defeat communism in the union movement. And in the lead up to the 1946 election, they criticised the Liberal policy of allowing the government to break strikes by freezing the funds of striking unions. Such a policy, according to the publication, would throw the decent unionists over to the side of the communist agitators. That's a quote. So Menzies was respected, however, by the publication for his foreign policy viewpoints. Menzies had joined with Mannix and others back in 1939 at a pro-peace rally in the Melbourne Exhibition building, and essentially supporting the appeasement policies of the government at that time. The publication praised him for his statesman-like talk in 1944 on the need for Japan and Germany to not be completely destroyed after victory in World War II. Menzies was heavily criticised by a range of forces, particularly those in communist unions or communist-influenced unions, because of his statements. But Menzies, according to Freedom, had understood the lessons of Versailles. He understood that the military case in Germany and Japan had to be removed, but that peace and stopping communism required economic prosperity to be available to the people of the defeated nations for the good of the world. As we'll see shortly, the publication also presented Menzies fairly with his concerns about the Labor referenda of the 1940s. So in total, Freedom and News Weekly received Menzies and the New Liberal Party in the 1940s as being too closely tied to the interests of large businesses and in a more sectarian era as representing an Anglo-Protestant establishment, and not understanding the social questions that needed to be addressed, and seeing them as perhaps being not effective in fighting communism. So how are we going for time, Georgina? Okay, well, I'll quickly just go through the response to the referendums. So essentially, an area of commonality between the two, Menzies Liberals and Santa Maria's movement, is their suspicion of Labor's reconstruction agenda after World War II. So in 1944, the Curtin Labor government held a referendum which was defeated that tried to put 14 powers into the Constitution, and they included things like national health, family allowances, foreign investments, monopolies, air transport, national infrastructure, and also, interestingly, statements upholding freedom of speech and freedom of religion, which is something that the movement, well, the freedom publication strongly advocated for. So the position of freedom, so the position of the movement, reflected their concern with centralisation. And they were always quite critical of these proposals before they crystallised. But given the location of the movement within the fight to control trade unions and its connection to the Labor Party, it always felt that it needed to advocate for a yes vote. But it also always did so with caution and with a request that an acknowledgement that the situation wasn't ideal. So in relation to the 44 referendum, they argued that while Australians had shown a healthy suspicion of all moves to centralise control in Canberra, it was okay to support this particular referendum because the need for these powers was essential because of the situation of World War II, but that in future they should be very cautious about granting those powers. And they were concerned, they expressed concern that the Communist Party of Australia was so heavily involved in advocating for those particular measures. And they argued after it was defeated that the reason for that was because of the communist affiliation. Now, Menzies, during the 44 referendum, supported the efforts of the Australian Constitutional League to oppose the 14 powers, and he, along with that league, advocated against it because he saw it as giving too much power to Canberra and effectively taking away powers that should have been left to the states. So I'll just, mostly what I'll address in the chapter when it's published is looking at the differences and similarities between Menzies and the movement in terms of their approach to those referendums, but also the communist referendum of 1951. So, but I've sort of run out of time, unfortunately, to go through too many of them. But I'll just finish off by saying that the core aspect that I'm interested in exploring is how both of these pillars, saw the threat of communism as the central issue in Australian politics. So Menzies saw it as a threat to Australia's distinctively British and liberal way of life, and Santa Maria saw it as a threat to religion and his ideals for implementing some kind of Christian social program in Australia, which emerged in the 1940s as well. But what I think is really important is to understand that anti-communism in Australia, which is often seen as a purely negative force, was prosecuted by two pillars of movements or groups that actually had a really positive vision of what a good society would look like. And I think looking at these pillars in relationship to each other is valuable. So thank you.
Thanks, Lucas. We'll now go to Q&A. There's a gentleman here.
That was very interesting. What were Menzies' views on Trotskyism? Because Trotsky was, of course, a Bolshevik, communist if you wish, but he was also an anti-Stalinist. And then another sort of unrelated question, or perhaps related question, is Abbott was a fan of Santa Maria and the movement. And could you maybe tell us a little bit about that as well?
Well, to be honest, I've never seen in anything that I've read a reference to Menzies talking about Trotsky, but maybe that's probably something which people who've written books on Menzies here might know. That might be something that people who've written books on Menzies here might know if he's said something about Trotsky. I'm not aware of him addressing that. In relation to Abbott...
David Kemp's not shaking his head. Sorry.
That's good. In relation to Abbott, well, we were talking before the event officially started today about Anne Henderson's involvement in university groups in an earlier time that were related to the National Civic Council and Bob Santamaria. My understanding is that Tony Abbott, when he went to university in the 70s, was involved in similar groups that could be called front groups for the Santamaria movement or the National Civic Council, and that he had a relationship with Santamaria in the last 20 years of his life, and that's where that connection and influence comes from. And I guess if you were to make a comment on how Abbott was influenced by that, perhaps Abbott definitely, if you look at his writings and his contributions to public life, was perhaps more suspicious of the, I don't like to use the term neoliberal because I don't think it's a great term, but let's just say he was more suspicious of the economically liberal agenda in the Howard government than other figures like, say, Peter Costello. So I think that's a connection.
I got the call.
Anne and then George, yes.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Charles.
No, I think what you've done is great. There's one thing we need to recognise about Santamaria and Menzies. Communism was a fairly new phenomenon. It dominated the 20th century by the end of it. But you're looking at the early part of the movement, they're Labour. They're in the Labour Party.
That's right.
Post 55, they're not.
Mm.
Menzies also, I don't think he had great thoughts about Trotsky. He didn't study, thoughts of Marx or anything. It's a pragmatic answer to what in the 30s was a serious division of society and threat to Wood Westminster-style government. So Menzies is coming at it from a very pragmatic angle. Santamaria is coming at it from a rather European-influenced guy, as you rightly said, Hilaire Belloc, whatever. But also Santamaria is a very complex man. His rural movement was on one side, but it was more than the church and more than his religion in his point of view and his News Weekly and all those further developments of his thought about anti-communism. So maybe we're getting you at a difficult spot because we've asked you to cut yourself off in time. But my experience of the movement, Santamaria, whatever, is a post-Labor movement. And it becomes much, much closer. And on the Liberal side as well, they get much closer together. But I do agree Santamaria was very anti-capitalism and he had some rather quaint and totally outmoded ideas about the economy.
That's right. I think in relation to that, I guess hopefully we'll explore this a bit more in the chapter, but what I'm suggesting is with the movement and with its publications, even though they're drawing on those European thinkers and Catholic social teaching, and Menzies is coming from his own British liberal heritage, they both have similarities in how they view the growth of the state and the importance of the independence of individuals and local communities, which puts them both at odds with the post-war agenda Labor, chiefly Labor and all that. So.
George.
I just wanted to add an observation about Tony Abbott, or two observations. His engagement with Santa Maria was much later than the 1970s, when he was a student at the university. I remember both Tony and Christopher Pine telling me about attending a conference or something of that nature, convened by the NCC, at which Santa Maria spoke, at which the guests were up-and-coming young Catholic politicians. I think Kevin Andrews may have been there as well. I wasn't. But that would have been at least as late as the late 1980s, if not a bit later still. I can't locate a date, but it was shortly before Abbott and Pine were elected to Parliament. Secondly, on Abbott's lack of comfort with the, as it were, the capitalist agenda, David Kemp, who sat in cabinet with him in the Howard government, may have some views to offer about that. But certainly when I sat in Tony's cabinet, he had at least ostensibly embraced the free enterprise agenda. I always had a feeling that he was not completely comfortable with it, but that was his private and public position.
Charles.
Yeah, thanks very much. I wondered if you'd like to say something about the role of anti-Semitism in the movement's ideology. I mean, I'm sure you know, that's often mentioned as a factor in that continental Catholic teaching, both its sort of anti-monopolies line, but also the anti-Bolshevik side of it as well.
Just in my reading of First Catholic Worker, which starts publication in 1936, and Santa Maria ceases association with by the early 1940s, and then Freedom or News Weekly from 1942, is there's definitely in Catholic Worker the adoption of I don't want to say pro-appeasement, but yes, essentially a pro-appeasement position in the late 1930s, and a concern with and an interest in various Eastern European governments and support for Franco's Spain, for example. In my research through those archives in Catholic Worker and Freedom and News Weekly, I don't ever come across explicit anti-Semitism or anything like that. But definitely some of the governments in Eastern Europe and in Europe more broadly that are supported or encouraged by the movement in those publications, they have anti-Semitism as a part of their culture. And I guess often the accusation is made that people like Balloch and others had anti-Semitic views, and that they viewed the modern capitalist economy and communism as being associated with Jewish populations. But those things aren't referred to explicitly in the publications. And I think that probably reflects the nature of Australian society at the time, which is that, yes, many European migrants to Australia might have come from cultures where anti-Semitism was quite open or explicit, but I don't think it was acceptable in the 1930s or 1940s in Australia to be explicit about that. And I don't believe that Santa Maria and his allies were personally anti-Semitic, but it is true that the European movements that they drew upon and supported have associations with anti-Semitism. That's a reality.
Thanks, Lucas.